and to earn their keep a little bit. Mark, when I first started reading your book, which is really about the fantastic and not so fantastic changes that are happening all around the world, I thought of something that Hillary Clinton said, I think in the lead up to the 2016 campaign, because somebody said to her, why weren't you in favor of gay marriage back in the 90s? You know, why were you so late to this? And she said, well, look, it's, you know, to each idea their time. And of course, it took me a while to get around to it. The wind shifted, the liberal consensus shifted. And do you think that's a fair defense? And why did the wind shift when they did?
So my book's called The Pink Line: Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because the wind shifted really quickly. And in fact, Barack Obama said that, I think correctly, that no social movement has achieved so much in so short a space of time as the LGBT movement. And I wanted to understand in this book why this happened in a generation, in ways that were not imaginable to me as a young man coming out in the 1980s, and also what effect this kind of this explosive new global conversation has had all over the world. So Hillary Clinton's right that people change and people's ideas change as contexts change. It's really interesting that when Bill Clinton signed into law the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which explicitly forbade Congress from passing any other law that would allow marriage equality, only 1/3 of Americans supported same-sex marriage. When Barack Obama chaired in 2013, after the Defense of Marriage Act was struck off the books by that extraordinary Supreme Court ruling, he was doing so in the United States where only 1/3 of Americans thought that there shouldn't be same-sex marriage. So in this generation, things flipped. And Obama and Clinton embraced gay marriage publicly when the polls said that it was okay to do so. It seems like privately they supported it a lot earlier, but they're politicians and they needed to play the game and fight their battles.
But as you point out in your book, it wasn't just America where ideas about gay marriage shifted. It was kind of all over the developed world.
Oh, and I don't know how one defines the developed world, but I'm South African, and South Africa was the 5th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage in 2006. And in fact, it was my marriage to Chetty, my partner in South Africa in 2009, that got me to Paris, which is where I met you and Simon, and became part of this network that is now Pandemonium University. And I think that's an important story, because that's really where the germ of this book came from, which is that I married Chetty, so he was being employed by the United Nations, and I married him so that we could get the spousal grants that would enable me to come to Paris. We'd been together since 1990, and we really didn't need a certificate for any other reason. And what was so fascinating is that the only reason why the United Nations at that point accepted me as a spouse of Chetty's was because our home country had legalized same-sex marriage, because of course the UN has to abide by the rules of its sovereign members. If we had been American then, in 2009, before the Supreme Court judgment that ended the Defense of Marriage Act, I wouldn't have got those spousal benefits. And this for me was one of the sharpest entry points I had into the notion that developed into this book, which is that there's a sort of new global frontier, which I call the Pink Line, which I think has come to define and describe, but also divide the world in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago.
And what's remarkable to me in reading your book is to see how these ideas spread from place to place, and even spread to places where there was no movement on the sort of legislative front. And in fact, where we forget talking about gay marriage, like you could be prosecuted and put in jail for for gay sex, or for even the hint of it. So can you talk a little bit about about the contagion effect of these ideas and how they spread?
You know, when Barack Obama says that no social movement has moved so quickly, it really is as a consequence of globalization, and it's the fact that this social movement happened at the high moment of globalization, and all the vectors of globalization, whether it's commodity capitalism and multinational corporations that are domiciled in the US or in the Netherlands, employing people in places like India and Brazil, whether it is mass migration, people moving across national boundaries, or very importantly, particularly in Asia and Latin America, people moving from the countryside to the city. And therefore sort of freeing themselves from the feudal bonds of kith and kin, much as happened in the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and North America over 100 years ago, or whether it's because of the digital revolution, which is, of course, you know, one of the most important, perhaps the most important vector of globalization, which means that ideas can spread kind of incredibly quickly and extraterrestrially. They can spread above global boundaries. So you might have a global boundary around Russia or Nigeria that says homosexuality is illegal, or that might even sort of claim spuriously, we don't have this Western contamination in our country, but the messages of this globalization, the messages of this identity are spreading, and all you really need is a cell phone, a smartphone, a little bit of bandwidth and some privacy, and you can download these ideas wherever you are, and begin to think about, well, hey, if I'm a woman and I'm attracted to women, maybe I don't need to marry a man. Maybe I don't need to be forced into marriage the way my mothers and my sisters were, because I have rights. And then you're going to sort of claim these rights. And by claiming these rights in a society where these rights have never previously been claimed before, you're going to kind of activate a form of cultural and political crisis against which there's going to be some sort of backlash. And this is really what's happened all over the world. So in many countries in the world, particularly in countries of the former British Empire, old laws criminalizing homosexuality had never been used against consenting adults until very recently, when suddenly there was this new movement that was so threatening, and the state needed to find whatever it had in its arsenal to try and keep this new threat down.
That is a very interesting part of your findings, because at the same time you found this opening, you found that this counter movement in places like Russia and Nigeria, and even against LGBT rights, and even in places where they're like Indonesia, and you talk about, I think, Pakistan as well, where there's traditionally been like an accepted third gender, suddenly that was no longer okay.
Well, that's very interesting. So in countries like, particularly in Southeast Asia and West Africa, there have been age-old third gender identities. In Indonesia, they're called waria. In Senegal, they're called gojigen. Many people would know about the hijras of India. And in some of these places, there's always been this sort of cultural space, and even a somewhat elevated cultural space for third gender people. In Southeast Asia, they're seen to be quite close to the divine. In West Africa, there's a certain role that they've played traditionally as social conveners, as people who hold parties and conduct certain cultural rituals. Now, what began to happen in the 21st century is that a notion of gay rights started seeding in these countries, often as a consequence of the AIDS epidemic, because the global public health system came to understand belatedly that one of the major vectors of infection was men who sleep with men. And therefore these people needed to be reached, and they couldn't be reached if they were underground. So there became a human rights component to the fight against AIDS. And gay organizations began to blossom with funding from organizations like the WHO and the Global Fund, as under the umbrella of public health. But what this did in some societies, like Indonesia and like Senegal, is it caused a moral panic. And one of the reasons it caused a moral panic is because if we're going to talk about the forces of globalization, it wasn't just these ideas of LGBT rights or safer sex that were being carried by globalization. Christian fundamentalism and Muslim fundamentalism too spread quicker as never before, whether it's the Christian Broadcasting Network of televangelists from the United States or Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia. Suddenly there were these new messages about religious fundamentalism. And in places like Indonesia and Senegal, it was sort of a perfect storm. And a moral panic kind of ensued against this new evil, this new secular evil brought by Western capitalism. And in some cases, like in Senegal, the prime avatars of this new evil were those age-old third gender people, like Gojigan. So what had been an age-old gender category now became an illegal sexual orientation identity. And overnight, the Gojigan disappeared. You will not find Gojigan in Dakar today the way you would have 20 years ago.
That's amazing. So your book is remarkable in that you give this kind of overview of the sort of large forces that are changing things, but you also do deep dives into many different countries, and you do a sort of close-up look in a just beautifully empathic and sensitive way of the lives people are living and the stories of their lives. I mean, there's so many places we could talk about, and you got really close to a lot of stories in this book, but I thought maybe we could start by talking about Russia. Would that what you found there and who you found there?
Yeah. Well, Pamela, as a journalist, and I know this is something you know because of the work you do too, for me, the best way of understanding sometimes inexplicable, huge transformation or social change is to sort of sit on the shoulder of somebody experiencing that change and to see how they negotiate it and perhaps even cause it. And this is a lesson I learned as a South African writing about the transition from apartheid to democracy. And it's a lesson I've carried through to the work I've done for the Pink Line in the journalism that I wrote before the publication of the book and then the book, is that I felt that if I was really going to understand this phenomenon, I needed to do it through people who live on the Pink Line and who experience these new geopolitical dynamics, who experience being weaponized in one way or another by the way this has become a new global political issue. And I was particularly interested in Russia because I could see the way, and this is common knowledge, the way a Pink Line was traced by Vladimir Putin in particular over the old kind of borders of the Iron Curtain, as if to say, the way we are going to now define Russian civilization and Russian society against the West is by seeing the West as this decadent, corrupt, secular, contaminating influence. And we're going to do this by showing how the West is trying to make us take on gay rights. In particular, the European Union, because if you want to join the European Union, you need to ascribe to those values. And this really is not so different to the way Stalin used homosexuality in the 1930s. There's an amazing article by Maxim Gorky, who was one of Stalin's sort of lapdogs in the press, in which he rails against the decadence of Western society, pointing out two things which sort of absolutely signify this decadence. The first is homosexuals and the second is pet shops. and this was just before Stalin criminalized homosexuality. So Putin's trying to do something very similar. And the way Putin is trying to do this, and also the way Putin is trying to bring the Russian Orthodox church on board as he's consolidating his power in the early 21st century is to go at homosexuals and to go at gay rights, to go at LGBT rights. And the way he does this is through a really pernicious law called the Anti-Gay Propaganda Act, which makes it illegal to promote homosexuality around minors. And promoting homosexuality is anything you do in public, right? But there was some word at the time that I was beginning to research this book. There was a panic because a legislator had put a bill into the State Duma suggesting that the state should have the power to take children away from gay parents, because just by being gay parents, they are promoting homosexuality to their children. So there was a panic. There was a panic. Many, many gay and lesbian families went underground or left the country. Very famously, Masha Gessen, who many of your webinar viewers might know, left with their wife and their kids to New York because they feared having their children taken away from them. So I decided that the way I was going to write about the pink line was that I was going to find queer families, gay or lesbian families in Russia, who were going to, and I was going to see how they were negotiating this. In my research, I interviewed dozens of such families, but I was really taken with the story of a person who was neither gay nor lesbian, but a transgender woman called Pasha Kaptanovska, who had lost, never mind custody of her son, but all rights of access to her son, because the co-parent claimed, and the court agreed, that by raising this child, Pasha would be corrupting this child through the promotion of homosexuality. So I tell Pasha's story. I've noticed in the chat that several people have mentioned Section 28, Margaret Thatcher's Section 28, and yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, never mind Section 28, but Anita Bryant and Miami and those movements in the United States too. The playbook for this from Russia comes from the West. And one of the things I do in the book is I track this. I track this particularly how a Western evangelical, an American evangelical movement called the World Congress of Families became involved with sort of a right-wing component of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it was in this kind of, I would call it cesspit, that the notion of the anti-gay propaganda legislation came about. But Pasha's story is very moving and very difficult. It was very difficult to write, and I think it'll be one of the more difficult ones to read, because here is somebody who transitioned in this globalized world, expecting a better life, and in many ways, you know, got what she needed, because as she says, if she wasn't able to transition, she might well have killed herself. There's a lot of data about the number of people who self-harm because of gender dysphoria and lack of access to the gender care that will enable them to transition. But in the process, she lost her son.
Yeah. Mark, you also went to Israel, Palestine, and you met an Israeli Palestinian, a Jewish Arab couple. Could you tell us about them and what happened?
Sure. So
line?
once more, as always, I try and find the ways that the pink line is drawn over other lines, other geopolitical frontiers. And in Israel, it seemed to me that the pink line was being sketched over the green line that divides Jewish Israel from the Palestinian occupied territories. And I was very interested in the way Israel stands accused by some of its critics of pinkwashing its human rights record by being so fervently pro-gay. And it is true that even though, of course, Israel is a theocracy and Orthodox Jews certainly don't permit gay marriage, that the secular part of the Israeli state is incredibly progressive when it comes to LGBT rights. That is true. And Tel Aviv is one of the gayest cities in the world, and Tel Aviv Pride is an extraordinary celebration. But Tel Aviv Pride is also a very nationalist celebration. You'll see more Israeli flags at Tel Aviv Pride than you will see American flags at New York Pride or Dutch flags at Amsterdam Pride. And there's a reason for that, because it's a matter of Zionist Israeli pride that Israel is so pro-gay. And this is one of the ways that Israel promotes itself, particularly to an increasingly skeptical Europe and North America, as a beacon of human rights and civilization in a very hostile neighborhood. Now, whether or not there's some truth to that, what was interesting to me was what that means for you if you are Palestinian and gay, like Fadi, the person I write about. Because you can imagine, leaving aside culture and religion in Arab society, which has its own approach to sexuality, if LGBT rights is being weaponized against Palestine in this way, you can imagine what the Palestinian movement thinks of LGBT rights. So Fadi and Nadav are this couple who live in downtown Tel Aviv. One is the grandson of an Auschwitz survivor. The other is the grandson of a woman who lost her home during the Nakba and still keeps the keys to a home in Haifa that she no longer has access to. And these two men find each other. And I don't want it to be a soppy Romeo and Juliet story. I hope, well, Romeo and Juliet isn't so soppy, it's got an edge, and this story has an edge too. But at its core is the very, very moving way, I think, that Fadi describes what it's like to be in Israel, to be celebrated for being gay, and yet to be denigrated for being Arab and Palestinian. So the pink line politics in Israel are very complex.
How did they meet, this couple?
How did they meet? Let me see if I can remember. They met at this amazing bar whose name is escaping me, in the old port of Jaffa, which was one of these incredible sort of free zones in Tel Aviv, which is gay and straight and Arab and Jewish and one of these amazing little oases that one finds all over the world of tolerance and liberalism. That's how they met. But interestingly, they both met each other's families. And Nadav's family, Nadav's father is a senior official in the Israeli defense apparatus, and Fadi's parents are staunch communists who wouldn't let him watch Israeli television when he was a child, because they didn't want him to learn Hebrew, because Hebrew is the language of the oppressor. And it's amazing to see how through the personal, I mean, the personal is the political, how through the personal, some kind of broader family unit was forged among these two families. I see somebody say, I look forward to their wedding. I mean, this is on the chat line. This is one of the very difficult things about writing nonfiction rather than fiction, which is that if you're writing nonfiction and you're following a story that's not your own story, that story has its own conclusion. And the conclusion of Fadi and Nadav's story is they split up very amicably. They're fine, they're still friends, but they, after many years together and many, many hours planning the wedding they were going to have in Cyprus, they decided not to marry.
Go ahead, Simon.
Mark, one interesting aspect of your book, a kind of new frontier in the US, is trance, which you have a lot of questions about. You have critical questions about it. Can you tell us what you saw in the US and what that provoked?
Yeah, so one of the things that was really striking to me is that, I wrote this book over a decade, over nearly a decade. And it was really striking to me how in the West, the pink line shifted over time from the L and the B, from gay rights, from same-sex marriage, over to transgender rights. And there are many, many reasons for this. The one reason is, and I think the dominant reason, well, there are two dominant reasons. One is that the religious right, having lost the marriage equality battle, needed a new war to fight, and transgender rights kind of presented itself. And the reason why transgender rights presented itself was because, as a result of partly of the successes of the gay movement, particularly engaging with the medical establishment around issues like depathologization, a transgender movement was really coming out. I mean, you'll all remember that Time magazine cover from 2015, the transgender tipping point with Laverne Cox of Orange is the New Black on the cover. Suddenly there was this sort of trance explosion. And there are many, many reasons for it. They're the two reasons I gave. They're also the sort of dogged activism to get the psychiatric establishment to stop seeing transgenderism as a pathology and to see it as a sort of natural variance of life. There are also changes in the culture, as one really interesting medical anthropologist put it to me, from a culture of illness to a culture of wellness, from a culture of sort of self-optimization, from a culture of finding pathologies to a culture of self-optimization and making oneself better, allowing the real me inside me, the true me, to come out, whether that means, you know, having plastic surgery or going on diet or in the case of transgender people, changing one's gender. A very different conception of the body started coming into being. And I guess if the sort of traditional conception of the body, rooted in religious tradition, is that the body is a temple that should not be defiled under any circumstances. There's a new conception in Western culture. It's been in other cultures for millennia, that the body is a home that you need to make yourself comfortable in, and that needs to suit you better. And if that means kind of altering the home, why not? So that you can live well in it.
Mark, you went to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Can you tell us about why you went there and what you found there?
So I was getting to that. So once I decided that this was the pink line that I wanted to look at in the United States, I was interested in understanding what I think is the frontier in the United States, which is this very controversial issue of early transition, and whether children, minors, should be permitted to change their genders to match the way they feel inside, to change the way they are outside to match the way they feel inside. And I particularly wanted to find a transgender kid who had gay or lesbian parents, because I wanted to look at these two generations of pioneers. My generation, I'm not a parent even though I'm gay, but my generation who were pioneering in their decision to make alternative families. And then the younger generation who are pioneering in the way that they are questioning gender and sexuality. And through a network, journalists, as Simon and Pamela both know, you know, we live and die through our networks. Through a network I came upon a family who live outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And through this family, I came upon an extraordinary youth group called Riot Youth, which is held by a youth organization, convened by a youth organization in Ann Arbor. And through this organization, I met a bunch of young people who I've followed into adulthood, and I tell their stories. And they're really complex stories, because I mean, these kids really are pioneers. And like all young people, they are experimenting. And like all young people, they have found an issue to kind of formulate their identities against the values of their parents. And if in my generation that might have been, you know, gay rights, in their generation, it's very much about gender. I'm sure many of the parents on this call have had robust conversations with their children about gender and what gender means, and what gender means for them as opposed to what it means for us. So it's in that foment that these young people have come of age, and I track their stories. Are you there?
Sorry, I'm unmuted now. I'm struck by the fact that gay marriage, which is so recent, has very quickly been accepted in the US and Western Europe, even by the right largely. So Trump is leading a culture war, but he doesn't attack gays. He doesn't attack gay marriage. Trans is different. But it seems that gayness has sort of been accepted by the mainstream.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, it's the power of the love is love argument. That is the significant shift that Barack Obama was talking about. And you're quite right. You know, Mike Pence, just 10 years ago, was a fervent anti-marriage equality warrior. He was a fervent proponent too of the rights of people to discriminate against homosexuals on the basis of religious freedom. You won't hear him talking about that anymore. And that is a very significant shift and a major success. And it's not just in the United States. Latin America is fascinating. In most of Latin America, marriage equality is legal now. And what's really interesting in Latin America is the way that's vaulted ahead of the reproductive rights movement. So in all these countries in Latin America, same-sex marriage is legal, but abortion is still illegal under any circumstances. Go figure. And it's partly because of the way that this notion of love is love, that marriage and family is something good, is far more easily marketable than killing a baby, which is what the anti-abortion activists would say. But there's a really interesting clue as to why this has happened in the amazing Irish referendum around same-sex marriage in 2015, where astonishingly in this Catholic society, so I can't remember the exact numbers, 62 or 64% of the population of those who voted in favor of same-sex marriage, even though the Catholic Church was opposed to it. And there are several reasons for this. One is that no one trusts the Catholic Church, and very few people trust the Catholic Church in Ireland anymore, given its abysmal record when it comes to dealing with pedophile priests. But another reason was articulated very beautifully by the Irish writer Colin Toibin. And he said, Ireland is an intimate society, and everybody knows everybody. And because of the power of visibility, because of the way over the past 30, 40 years, gay people have come out, everybody has like a family member, a son, a parent, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker who's gay. So it becomes personal. And if you think about the person rather than the ideology, it becomes much more easy to understand how that person should have the same rights as you do. And the marriage equality movement in the United States, in Ireland, and in Australia was really successful in doing that. Now, there's a consequence to that, and you've preempted this consequence in the chat note you've just written about Poland, Simon, and I think this is really important because the culture wars have this very powerful way of warping to kind of suit new conditions. And because of this phenomenon that I've just described, the way the religious right wing now fights these battles is rather than attacking people, it attacks ideology. So you won't be attacking gay people anymore. You might, from a Catholic religious frame, sort of damn the sin but not the sinner. What you'll be attacking is this ideology which is pernicious, like communism, and is infecting your country. And so when you looked at the campaign in Poland in the recent elections, which Andrzej Duda won by a hair's breadth, it was all about an assault on LGBT ideology. And this is similar to the way all over the world there are new attacks on something called gender ideology. And I really think this is something we need to look out for because it's a big thing in the United States. It's a huge thing in Brazil and Latin America. It's becoming bigger in Africa too, and in Russia. This is the new assault of the culture wars. No longer against gay marriage or LGBT people, because that's been normalized. Now against this ideology that is taught to children and that tells children that gender is a construct rather than sex is something that is God-given. And in fact, this battle was first fought in France, where a movement tried really hard to get the curriculum to not use gender. It was not successful, but right now in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro is passing a bill which will make it illegal to teach the concept of gender in Brazilian schools.
Mark, something else. There's also a divide within the liberal left. You saw that in the controversy around J.K. Rowling, who argues that trans men who transition to female gender, female sexuality, are not actually women. How do you see that argument sort of among people who are broadly sympathetic to gay and trans people? How do you see that argument?
No, this is a very significant. This is a very, very significant difference in the pink line now over transgender issues in particular, whereas which is that that transgender people in their struggle for self-determination and for human rights have to fight a battle on two fronts, because there's the religious right wing, and there's also a very strong feminist, often lesbian left wing, and the feminist resistance to transgender identity goes all the way back to the early 1970s, and the notion that if you ever lived as a man, and if you ever had a penis, you have been part of the patriarchy, and you cannot switch sides, and a sort of biological notion of womanhood as being vested in your biological organs, because according to this argument, that is what makes you female. It's what makes you a woman in society as well, the fact that you are able to reproduce. So if you're not able to reproduce, how can you call yourself a woman? As well as that, there is an argument that really, I have to say, was hatched on the right wing, but has been taken on with sort of gusto by feminists on the left, particularly in the United Kingdom, which is that the rights of a minority are affecting the safety of a majority. And one of the big arguments against transgender rights is that it's going to enable people who are not born women to enter female-only spaces. And there's obviously a controversy about this on the sports field, because bodies with testosterone have more power than bodies without testosterone. But it's an argument that's also used about women-only spaces and carceral institutions. If transgender women are put with women in prisons, with cisgender women, which is what the trans movement calls women who are born biologically, are those cisgender women going to be threatened? Are cisgender women and children going to be threatened in restrooms and toilets if a man can just call himself a woman and go into that space? So it's become a big argument as to whether trans people should be allowed to self-identify. In other words, anybody can go into a Home Affairs office and say, I am a woman, and therefore I'm a woman, or whether you have to go through some certification process, including psychiatric testing, to see whether you really are transgender, or whether perhaps you're just trying it on for nefarious purposes. So that's the argument that's raging at the moment in Britain. And it seems that the Conservative government, which was initially going to go with the self-determination route, is now going to keep some form of certification in the process. There are already 12 countries in the world that allow full self-determination, led by Argentina and by Denmark, but 12 more, mainly in Europe and Latin America, and Pakistan, interestingly. And really, I mean, there might be people who will show data that disagree with me, but I've looked at this closely, and nobody has shown me any data from these countries who have had self-determination since 2012, that there's been any increase of violence against women and children because of transgender self-determination. There is a problem of gender-based violence in the world, of men committing violence to women. And J.K. Rowling talks about this in her very moving essay. But how that would, how that affects, how you would use that against transgender people's rights is something that is frankly beyond me.
Well, I want to ask about that. Sorry, Pamela, I'll ask this, and you can go next. If there aren't cases of transgender people attacking women in, say, women's bathrooms, why is this such an important issue for someone like J.K. Rowling and others? Can you explain what that impetus is?
I mean, I think you'd have to ask her. The way it was explained to me, and I'm not going to ventriloquize for J.K. Rowling and for super articulate feminist activists who hold this position, some of whom I really respect. So some of whom might be on this call and might want to talk about it. I'd encourage them to. But you know, I did this amazing interview with the attorney in the United States who represents the families of transgender children who are trying to get the right to use the bathrooms congruent with their gender identities. And he says he has spent a huge part of the last decade fighting these cases, trying to understand where the fear and the anxiety comes from. And his explanation is that we are so programmed to understand from the moment we think about the children we have, from the moment, the first question anybody asks you about a child is it a boy or is it a girl? It's so much part, not just of normative biology, but of our culture, that movements that a questioning of that is profoundly threatening. And you can understand why. I mean, in a case like Rowling, how if you have, because of your lived experience, a fear of male violence, how you might project that onto transgender women, because you've experienced violence from men in the past. I would say as I said, the answer to that is to deal with gender-based violence.
Wasn't another part of Mark, wasn't another part of her argument that kids were taking hormone blockers at a young age and then changing their minds later on? She was concerned about that.
She is concerned about that, and that's another very significant argument of the people who call themselves gender skeptical or gender critical. Their belief that this is a trend, that this is a fad, and that young people experiment, that young people might be being deceived by what they see online, particularly, and there is some data to back this up. There's been a dramatic increase of adolescent girls, born girls, announcing that they are now trans. Dramatic, whereas the number of born boys who are announcing that they are now trans has remained stable, and there are many explanations given for this. The explanation by some feminists is that it's really difficult to be a girl in this society, and if you can see an escape hatch and become a boy, why wouldn't you? Another explanation given is that there have always been a very high number of masculine girls in the world, and in the past they found their space in butch lesbian culture, and many of them still find their space in butch lesbian culture. But if the trans option had been open to them a generation ago or 2 generations ago, they might have taken it, because actually they feel themselves to be men, but there wasn't the option to be men at that time. It's a really complicated debate, because issues of medicine really do become intertwined with issues of rights, and there are certainly practitioners, the practitioners I interviewed in the United States, who take incredible care before agreeing that a minor can transition. And no one who is claiming the rights to self-determination, no one is suggesting that children should have those rights to self-determination too. But as somebody said to me who is an advocate for transgender children and their families, in our culture, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, and Pamela, you know this more than anyone because of your book bringing up Bebe, we do have a culture that listens to children. Children are no longer seen but not heard. I mean, maybe they are still seen and not heard in France, which is what your book is about a little bit. But if you're going to ask children who they are, if you're going to ask children what they want, what their dreams are, what is going to fulfill them, what makes them whole, you have to be prepared to listen to the answer. And it's out of that shift in the culture towards listening to children, and perhaps, to some people would say to a fault, empowering children, that this movement has come about. Now, some people see these young people as pioneers who really are changing the culture, changing medicine, changing healthcare, and creating space for new generations, so that you don't have this appallingly high number of gender non-conforming kids who self-harm when they hit puberty. Others see these kids as guinea pigs who are being used. I think it's clear where I fall on that, but I think it is really a new science, and the kids who I met in Ann Arbor are really the first generation, and there's so many questions to which we don't have answers, but there's so many questions to life to which we don't have answers. There's so many decisions that young people make that they regret when they're older. There's a lot said about how many regretters there are. People who transitioned in their teens and who've now grown up to regret it, and you will find interviews with such people on BBC documentaries, sort of in the name of fairness, but the data does not back up yet that there are a significant number of regretters. Maybe we'll still come to see that because it's in its early days.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, we have a question from Augusta Gonzalez, which is, has LGBTQ history entered the school curricula anyway?
I'm sorry, Simon, I missed that question because your line went off a bit. Could you repeat it?
He was asking a question from Augusta Gonzalez, which is, has LGBTQ history entered the school curricula? And if so, where?
It varies, and it really depends on what the advocacy has been like. So, I mean, there's two LGBT history as opposed to kind of life orientation, which is about and sex education, is strangely less contentious. If it's part of history rather than about asking children to consider who they might be in terms of their sexual orientation and their gender. In the United States, it has a lot to do with school district by school district. In Brazil, there was a really powerful LGBTQ education sort of package that was introduced by Dilma Rousseff. That was one of the main ways she was attacked by the religious right wing. And she had to pull back on a lot of it. But I do believe that history is still taught. Certainly in Western European curricula, you'll see a lot of it. But I'm not a curriculum expert, so I can't get more detailed than that.
Mark, for one last question, I just want to bring up something question you raised in your book about this sort of chicken and egg question, which is, do you change the laws and that changes people's attitudes, or do you wait for people's attitudes to change in order to change the laws? And you tell this great story of this grandfather in South Africa who first berated his granddaughter for being a lesbian, and then finally came around to it and started demanding a bride price for her wife.
Right. I mean, he did more than berate. He actually assaulted. He assaulted his daughter's partner. And then he came around to demanding a bride price from that same partner. And what happened in that moment was that in the way of these things, everybody landed up in the local police station. It was just after Nelson Mandela came to power, and the station commander, who was a young black woman, which in itself was an extraordinary novelty. I mean, not an older white man, but a young black woman. She pointed to a photograph of the president, Nelson Mandela, sort of above her head, and she said, he accepts this. This old man who liberated us accepts this. And what she was talking about is the Constitution, which after all was discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And so the station commander said, if he can accept it, you guys sort your shit out. And yeah.
So in terms of the chicken and egg issue, do you think there's scope for places like Senegal to take a slightly more, to lead with the laws and hope that attitudes will follow, especially because so many people know gay and lesbian?
it's a really uneasy dance, and those the South African changes didn't come out of nowhere. Like, we were incredibly blessed in South Africa to have religious leaders like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and a sort of liberation theology that didn't activate a right-wing opposition to equality for LGBT people in the same way that the imams activated in Senegal, or the way religious leaders activated in Nigeria or Uganda. So it's way harder in theocracies, or in societies that are functional theocracies. Where I think there is scope is in secular societies like India and like a lot of Latin America, where there's Mexico is fascinating to me, and I have one of my chapters in Mexico, because Mexico is a very, it's a very macho society, and it's a very religious society, but the division between church and state is kind of is inviolate in Mexico. The modern Mexican state is grounded in that. Similarly, the modern Indian state is grounded in secularism, even though Narendra Modi is trying to change that with his appalling sort of Hindu communalist politics. And in such societies, I think law really can play its role in that uneasy dance.
Mark, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up here. There's so many other places. Bravo to you for figuring out a way to fit them all into a book.